Welcome back to the Global Report podcast. I'm joined always by my co-host, William Lawrence. We are excited today to be joined by Stewart Sarkozy, who is the managing director of the World Ocean Council, which is a new role for you, Stewart. Welcome on board. It's exciting to have you. And how are you settling into your new role?
Thanks for having me. It's good. It's been a really interesting transition because we're at a point, especially in the global ocean work, that there are so many things happening. World Ocean Council has been involved and kind of a leader for some time in various verticals within that ocean health and broader ocean efforts. And so me coming in, it's a new role for the organization and a new role for me. And so it's an interesting combination of things that I had been doing combined with new efforts and new strategy at the organization. So it's been just a month and a half or a month and 3 weeks. And so it's been quite a learning curve. And then there's been a lot of other things going on, including global ocean conferences and things like that. I'm heading to one tomorrow again. So super busy and kind of an exciting time generally for me, for the organization, and for the work that we're doing.
That's awesome. And so knowing you, you've always got a few different roles going on. You're also with the Ocean Sewage Alliance, and you're the founder of Precovery Labs. Can you tell us a little bit about those organizations? And then we'll also sort of do a dive into the work that World Ocean Council does as well.
Sure. And they are interlinked. I was the acting executive director for the Ocean Sewage Alliance until the end of January this year, starting last July. And I'm still the steering committee chair, and the way that the organization is set up, that's also the chair and the vice chair are also very active through the steering committee. So it's great because I get to continue some of the work, but now we have a fantastic new executive director, Jasmine Fournier, and that work globally on ocean sewage and wastewater overlaps a lot with the work with Northeast Maritime Institute and the Center for Ocean Policy and Economics, and our discussions on the way that what appears to be something that everyone thinks is solved, or that the ocean's too big to get dirty, continues to be something that really we're able to engage on. It also overlaps with World Ocean Council because so much of this has to do with large government entities, corporations, and others doing the right thing. So we kind of stop the flow, and those positions and that work really came from some of the consulting work I was doing under Precovery Labs, and that I started some time ago as a way of getting ahead of, or trying to get ahead of, a lot of the recovery work that I'd previously been involved in, and the resilience building in all kinds of sectors. So I'm fortunate that I kind of create a stack of work. Sometimes too much, sometimes too little. But the Precovery Labs work allows me to do very specific, very localized work on tools and projects and sort of interventions that overlap with the work with those other entities. So I do always have a number of things, number of balls in the air, and trying to keep things moving.
And the underlying theme to all the work that you're doing, two items here, really: recovery and resilience, which seems to sort of excite you and drive you. How did you get into those topics, and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, I'd been doing what would loosely be called sustainability and community development work, especially through community development finance, and most of it in indigenous communities. And the thing that really, made the change for me, but also I think was a kind of timing and a bit of a mind shift for the entire United States and the country, was I was with the Obama administration and doing international and philanthropic work. And I became part of the Hurricane Sandy Recovery Task Force. And that work led to a real decision point for me, which was, do I keep doing kind of post-disaster recovery, rebuilding, and sit on the side of, oh, now what do we do because this thing has happened? or do we do something that's resilience building? It's when I started Pre-Recovery Labs, as a matter of fact, because the idea is that we're living on this kind of recovery treadmill. And it was during that post-Sandy rebuild, the start of what became a program at Rockefeller Foundation, the 100 Resilient Cities program, which I was there for the very early days on. That was a real decision point, because my tact then was go for the resilience building, the pre-recovery mindset, as opposed to sort of being ready for the recovery of a disaster that's going to happen. And as we've seen since that disaster, there's been an uptick in it, right, in terms of intensity and timing and typologies. So that was a real shift to go from what I would call sustainability and kind of more on the recovery side and some of the work that was happening in the government to something that was much more proactive. And I think that's what worries me about the ocean and water, frankly, which is why I'm concentrating even more on that now, is we are way behind on adaptation work. We are not doing enough on mitigation. And it's nothing we can mess with, because that system breaks, the planetary systems break. So I think that's where my pre-recovery mindset sort of emerged out of the recovery.
Now, Bill, did you do any work similar to this when you were at State Department in the Bureau of Ocean, Environment, and Science?
So yeah, nice to have you with us, Stewart. So I spent 5 years of my 11 years in government in the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science. I was in the science office, but because we were the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, we had a lot of oceans-related work that we did. I worked more specifically on the science side, and I also worked a lot on international negotiations and international delegations, visits, that sort of thing. I could now list 100 different things I worked on, in a 5-year period. I think the most interesting was we helped, or one of the more interesting things is we helped Florida Atlantic University develop a relationship with the Egyptians and got them donated a submersible for Red Sea research, given the incredible things that are going badly in the Red Sea, and then efforts to study it and mitigate against it, and helping the Egyptians develop their sector, their ocean sector, was really interesting. There was a famous Egyptian Jacques Cousteau type figure named Goha, who had this show all Egyptians watched in their youth called, I forget what it was called, Ocean Life or something like that. And we actually helped build a research facility next to the sort of hut he used to do his Red Sea research out of, which was really interesting. And then that connected me later to this whole, the problem with the Safar, which you and I have talked about previously, and saving the Red Sea from a lot of damage that could have happened with that. But the thing I was thinking when Stewart was talking, to loop this back around to what's been discussed so far, is there's this constant push and pull in the whole area, what we might call development, between short, medium, and long-term stuff. And when things are going crazy, there's all this money and attention that goes into the recovery. And then when things sort of start shifting back to normal, we all wonder, what we should have been doing long-term and in terms of building resilience. And I've come to the conclusion that you have to do the short-term, long-term, and the long-term, short-term at all times, which is exactly the space that Stewart's in, right? Because you have to, when you're doing short-term recovery, you have to think about the long-term actions and benefits. And when you're doing long-term work, you have to be building up the capacity for the short-term disasters, which are going to come at a greater and greater frequency and severity with global warming. So the other thing I was thinking is, as he was talking, is how poorly we educate citizens about the oceans. You know what I mean? Like people just don't know, and I'm wondering about what Stewart has in mind. So I'll turn this back to you, Stewart, now. Like, what about just the problem of educating everybody about our responsibility and dependence on the ocean? I mean, obviously you could do curriculum in school, but, let me just posit that's in one ear and out the out the other ear of a lot of young people. So it's not just schools. Like what are you thinking about getting citizens resilient and citizens ready for what's coming?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's two stories that come to mind immediately. One is something that's happening next week. We're doing a session at the UN Ocean Decade of Science conference, which is going to be massive. It's in Barcelona. It was completely oversubscribed, something like 5,000 registrations for 1,000 slots, and then they expanded it to 1,500, and way too many sessions that were submitted. Next Friday, we're doing a session. It's just a private roundtable to start the process of creating a bigger event. And we're calling it Blue Glue because the idea is, how do we connect ports and cities and the stakeholders in communities of any size, educational institutions, et cetera, to this kind of idea that the blue economy and coastal resilience is all intertwined, especially as we're trying to be more proactive about coastal resilience building. And your question really begs one of the questions that we're asking our roundtable, which is, how do we get educational institutions from primary through master's and PhD programs to think of the ocean the same way they do about terrestrial issues? Because we don't. It's just sort of it's out of sight, out of mind.
If I could jump in, if I learned anything during my 5 years in the Oceans Bureau at State, it's almost more important than terrestrial issues. Ocean health is a bigger deal, and people just don't understand that.
No, it's interesting. And when you dig into the reports, or you're doing things like the Ocean Sewage Alliance or my work at World Ocean Council, you realize that coming from a city perspective, you don't think of the water the same way that you think of the land. And in reality, it is the thing that drives both what we do in our houses, because as the book says, everybody poops, right? So we don't think about the water. We don't think about how it cycles. We don't think about how we use it, how we reuse it. In our case, we don't, and the physical infrastructure that's necessary for it. But we also don't think of what's under the surface of the water, because it's really hidden away. And that tends to be the thing that creates a lack of literacy around oceans, right? So that is a big deal. And and to be honest, there's some really amazing organizations that are doing very specific ocean literacy work. And some of them are going to be there in Barcelona next week. Just to get people to start to think differently about curriculum. So maybe in one ear, out the other. The other thing is that, and we experience this in work in various communities, the way that the systems came to some places, especially island nations and perhaps indigenous communities and coastal areas, that what was a very marine or ocean-centric society removed itself from that. And if you even think about just the general kind of development of our planet and its resources and capitalism and industry, we were much more water focused for a long time, both in terms of trade, in terms of travel, in terms of all kinds of things. And so there is a real sense that we as human species, except for a few places, right, have lost touch with that. And we were much more aware. We always fished, right? We always kind of used the sea and gave back to it in a certain way, but within certain limits, right? So one of the things that was really interesting a couple of years ago, doing some work that actually involved NMI and COPE, the work in Puerto Rico had to do with kind of bringing people back to the water, because so many bad things happened over time that citizens had sort of turned their back. One of the governors and one of the university presidents said, look, we turned our back on the sea. We need to turn and face it now, right? And I think that's really it's pretty telling, because everything from invaders and slave ships and other things came to the shore, but so did stuff floating in and wrecks and all kinds of things that changed economy and society. So your point is super well taken, in the sense of, like, how do corporations view it? How do citizens view it? How do governors and presidents and mayors and their citizens all view what sometimes is very close out their front door, right?
Yeah.
And it's just a disconnect that we've developed. It wasn't always there, but we've developed this disconnect, and I think that literacy has to be top to bottom.
And I have one follow-up, two aspect follow-up question before we go back to Morgan. It was really interesting that you referenced cities, because when we think about the ocean, we often think about the smaller coastal towns and coastal developments being the ocean's people, but actually cities depend more on and need more education around it. So what is your thinking about, urban education on oceans, or sort of bringing the oceans to cities the way New England Aquarium does in its own small way? And, with that, in Boston, but what are you thinking about bringing bringing the oceans to cities? And then the other sort of related question is, everybody goes to the beach, but I rarely go to the beach unless it's like an Audubon beach and get educated. They might have a sign up saying, look out for this nest, or, here are some birds you can learn about and what the tidal pool's doing. So how can we use the fact that everybody goes to the coast to educate them while they're there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'll start with the second question, because it's one of the dilemmas about things like creating marine protected areas, which often the average citizen doesn't know about. And even if they do, they just hear it kind of sort of as a side conversation, or maybe they see a sign that sits on the coast and it sort of points out there, like, there's a marine protected area. Again, it's underwater, right? I just came back from California yesterday, and you think about the incredible kelp forests that grow just below that surface, that are teeming with life. They sequester carbon, and they provide food, they provide economy, etc. But unlike when you go to Yosemite, most of what you do when you sit on the beach is you look at that, right? Unless you're a diver, or are swimming off of a boat, or you're on a reef somewhere, right? Especially in cold waters where the kelp grow. So you bring up a good point that often is the discussion of, like, how do we make the general public more aware of what MPAs are? How do we kind of flip the script of the terrestrial signage that we always see, right? Because in fact, most of us do just kind of go to the edge. We might get in the water a little bit. Maybe you're surfing, maybe you're diving, maybe you're a sailor. Like, I'm fortunate because I do all those things. And that's where my kind of love started for the water and for the ocean. But we can't do the same kind of signage, right? And I think that's part of the literacy piece, is making people aware. And this gets to your first question.
Yeah.
Even in the city resilience strategies I did sometimes all around the globe, the ocean was like one step further than they were thinking about, right? And I think part of it too is it's seen as a resource and something that can't be hurt. And I think one of the messages, a tough message, but like from ag runoff to sewage and wastewater to any number of other topics, we're starting to put pressures on the ocean, and have been for some time, which is why you see coral bleaching and current changes and temperature changes. As the planet heats, it also changes those things at the same time. So there's
we
sort
saw
of like
Egypt worse than here. It was just incredible.
When I drove in Egypt a couple of years ago after COP, right? Like it was, and Jamaica just had a massive bleaching. The Great Barrier Reef had another massive bleaching, and if the bleaching goes over a certain tipping point, then we're starting to talk about extinction, right? And so I think for cities, to go back to the first part of your question, cities have to, as like a person, engage and understand much, much better. The New England Aquarium is amazing. They're a partner to Sea Ahead, who I'm involved with as a mentor for their Blue Swell projects. But organizations like Northeast Maritime Institute and COPE need to kind of be scaled and replicated in ways that are not there yet, right? It's still almost a niche. And ironically, 70% of the planet, just like our bodies, is water. And we sort of have the opposite in terms of like how much we know about it, how much we've mapped, less than 10%, right?
The oceans die, we die, and people just don't understand that.
Thousands of species that we haven't even identified. I mean, last year alone, there were, at various times, 1,000, 2,000 species being discovered on these major deep water research projects. So I think part of it is that naturally people in the middle of the country don't understand when they throw a piece of plastic in a river or they are using a fertilizer, that gets down into the ocean, right? It's why we have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and the United States and other parts of the world. The water goes where it needs to, right? And it takes our crap, to say it nicely, with it, and it ends up in the ocean. And I think that's part of the disconnect that we have right now.
When I was, because of all this traveling around the globe doing oceans work, I got to see a lot of things that I think everybody should see. One of the most memorable moments was when we were at Mbari looking at what their submersibles had been discovering. And it won't shock you guys, but I remember turning to them and I said, how often when you go out do you see something you've never seen before? And they said, every day. And that blew me away. The other thing, and again, I'm summarizing 5 years here, but I'll throw this back at you. The thing I was the most freaked out about when I left 5 years at OES was ocean acidification. I was wondering if you could say something about acidification.
Yeah. There's a session next week on ocean acidification, and there is the Ocean Sewage Alliance and the OA Alliance, which is the International Ocean Acidification Alliance, really have an alignment and have joined each other's groups, because some of those effects from sewage and wastewater and ag and warming align with the acidification problems. And so if you don't, like with resilience, if you're not looking at kind of co-benefits and ways of addressing these things you do on one hand are going to affect the other. And the acidification curve is still going the wrong way, as is the warming, as is plastics, as is we're going the wrong way, right? And the irony is that things like climate mitigation and adaptation are almost going backwards. If you look at the curve as a kind of XY, right? We're not doing enough to recover and prepare, let alone fix the thing that's causing the problems in the first place, right? So I always sound like a downer in these kind of conversations, but fact of the matter is that the urgency, or my worry beads, continue to be these things that could create unstoppable tipping points at this point. And I think that's part of what we have to pay attention to.
I always get, sorry, the last thing I'll say.
No worries.
But I always feel, both on the climate change issue and the ocean issue, nervous about talking about tipping points, because it's not true that tipping points aren't true and that things actually get rapidly worse. Like, things getting bad isn't linear. There are tipping points. But on the other hand, if we educate people about tipping points and then we don't meet our targets, it's as if, it's almost like when people say, things can't get worse when they always can. It'll be a lifelong struggle for us to make the oceans better. It'll be a lifelong struggle for us to mitigate climate change. Whatever tipping points targets we meet, don't meet. I understand the reason for it, to policies, get everyone moving in the right direction. But the way I look at it, and tell me if I'm wrong here, we're just going to be fighting our contribution to and the effects of climate change and ocean degradation our whole lives. And we're going to lose more than we win, but we can win, right?
Yeah, I think in the long run we can win, but that winning may really change how we function and how systems work and what kinds of technologies we use. And I think it's multiple generations before that point. And that's why I'll remove the word climate. Adaptation finance has to increase at incredible rates at this point, because we're not going to see a sudden drop in seas. We're not going to see a sudden cooling. We're not going to see a sudden lack of plastic. We're not going to see a sudden, I can keep going, right? So the adaptation side of it, from a funding and financing standpoint, has to massively increase, because the seawalls aren't high enough, or
Yep.
they're just not even going to work, right?
Yep.
So we're going to be talking about moving communities. It's already happening in the Gulf Coast and in Alaska and different places. So it's, to your point, right? Tipping points may not even be the right reference. It's an ability to start to tackle the things that are going to happen anyway,
Right.
and also work on, the stuff that's causing it, right? And this is like both sides of the brain work, right? So sometimes people really have trouble with that. Certainly some politicians do, to be frank, right? They don't want to fund the stuff that hasn't happened yet. But to your point about the long term and the short term and the short term and the long term,
Yep.
that's literally what you have to do if you're going to be ready, right? You have to prepare for what hasn't happened yet. And I think, luckily, the accounting or the economics behind it is there. Like the numbers are getting clearer on spend $1 here, save 14 here, spend, X trillion here, save X trillion there, right? Those numbers are getting clearer. And a lot of cities in particular and national governments know those numbers, even if they don't say them out loud. They know those numbers.
Morgan?
Yeah, it's a great segue because that's actually what I wanted to talk about, was sort of the challenge of covering the cost of investing in adaptation and kind of pre-covery, to allude to this company that you have here, right? So we have this discussion going on in places like the United States right now that our federal debt is too high. We're spending too much as a government. And I think that, to me, is a challenge. And it's also scary because I think as a result of the need to adapt, the government itself is going to have to spend a lot of money to protect, to adapt, to amend, to change these coastal communities that are really the main economic drivers of our entire country. And it's hard to justify those costs from the perspective of you are not going to have a direct revenue benefit per se from that investment, right? The investment is you are preventing a collapse of future revenue streams. And I think for a lot of people, that's hard to justify mentally. And it's why private finance and homeowners, for example, are going to be hard pressed to want to reinvest their money because they're doing it really with no direct revenue stream benefit in the short term, right? So we as human beings looking at that short-term revenue opportunities, that doesn't really exist in the perspective of adaptation and recovery, right? And so how do you view that challenge being overcome? How do you get buy-in from the federal government to say, yes, there is not going to be a short-term benefit to this, but we shouldn't wait until the long term where our entire coastal economic engine gets battered and the investment to repair, to get back up to speed is going to be tenfold than it would be today.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is very much a human nature thing. I will often say that humans don't like to write wills or buy insurance for everything under the sun, or they don't like to. It's just a human thing that it's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen to me. I mean, this is just and this comes a little bit from our comfort zones, right? In our kind of, we don't live in places on the East Coast right now that are like the ones that were there when the first storm started coming in. So there's a little bit of a comfort zone. It's not going to happen to me. I think there are places where it's gotten worse more quickly recently, and they have woken up a bit more, right? And the insurance companies have started to say, we don't know if we can insure there. That is scary, right? So that starts to create action that's legislative, policy driven, right? And that is what in part has to happen. I mean, I think to your point, though, on the corporate side, which is where the World Ocean Council really has a role to play, companies now see that if they don't handle this and work with governments to change the adaptation measures or to do their own changes, like the shipping industry has really started to move more quickly on carbon reduction, those curves start to like intersect with their own economic well-being. And I think COVID also woke people up. When supply chains broke down because of COVID, which was a health issue, and, or from a physical infrastructre standpoint, you think when the Suez Canal was blocked there for a while and it started to knock off, like this happens in wartime, and we see this with Ukraine, and obviously we see this with Gaza.
But
at the same time, right, it can happen in lots of different ways, and I think while it's difficult, one more episode. In fact, the ship that hit the bridge here in Baltimore, right? Because I'm not too far away from Baltimore. If that were not a ship and it was a natural cause, I mean, one of the things that immediately people realized is, wow, with the bridge laying in the water, the ships can't leave and the ships can't come in. They needed to do a special dredge quickly because they needed to get oil to the Air Force Base, fuel. Rocket fuel, jet engine fuel, right? So you start to kind of take that apart a little bit and you make it real for people. I think what's harder is, and this is also related to that bridge, there were things constructed that were built in a manner that is a great example where when one span fell, the rest of them fell. So from a kind of design standpoint, a resilience design standpoint, we can get the average citizen better roofs with hurricane straps before they put solar on, so that they're not only safer, but they're also more resilient if the power goes off because they've got battery and generator backup with solar on roofs that don't blow away, right? So we can do windows and insulation as well as solar, and literally drive their costs down. And this isn't just for the wealthy, right? The point is to make sure that this is a very equitable change in our energy consumption and transition. And I think you can almost take that up a scale to the corporations and to the cities and to others. And there are some that are doing it better than others. But that cost benefit ratio, one of our chief resilience officers said to me during a session, you need to call it resilience value engineering. So that what we're doing is we're putting a value on the resilience building, not just on a kind of cost benefit standpoint, right?
Right.
Oh, that cement is cheaper, let's use it. Well, if it only lasts 5 years and not 15, and it's got poison in it, and it's giving off carbon, like we can start to put accounting to this, right? So I think what we have to do is do a better job on the economics, private and public, and we have to do a better job on sort of what those accounting figures are. Like, do it now, do it later. One story, just the chief resilience officer for Lagos, and she has told this story a number of times, so I'm not talking out of turn. She's done it in public venues. But she described how they did a study, and they know that in the Port Harbor Lagoon area, basically, if they spend $8 billion now to fix the sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, flooding, informal housing, harbor, port situation, and they spend $8 billion now, they end up saving $40 billion from the next disaster that occurs when the next storm comes, right? Which doesn't even account for the migration that occurs because people are displaced, right? So there's a kind of trickle on and off that I think we have to get much, much better at talking through. And it's kind of uncomfortable, but it's at least it's accounting and science based, and that's what I have to rely on.
Yeah. So speaking about solutions and projects, you are launching a platform called Octopus, OKHTAPUS. Can you tell us a little bit about Octopus and what your plans are with it?
From new.
I would pronounce that octopus.
Exactly, because it's actually Farsi. My co-founder is from Iran, so we've already said that if Octopus does not go forward, we have a whole peacekeeping piece that we're gonna work on together. I'm joking because this better work. So Octopus is designed to do some of what we're talking about, which is take solutions and innovators that are proven, connect them with projects and enablers that need those solutions, and then find the funding and financing to make that happen. And in my work and in her work previously, especially, we often sat in that middle space, and the NGOs and others who are doing good project-based work, or even some of the governments, State Department, USAID, those are moving too slow. And especially because Octopus is focused on ocean and water and nature-based solutions, we have to go even faster to the points you guys have already made and we've been talking about. So we're just launching, we're just doing pitches, we're just creating this. But the idea is that once the platform is set up, it becomes a global replication process so that we find the best solutions that have already been proven, and we replicate and we scale and we connect into the project owners, wherever they might be, and the funding and financing. Because it's a real frustration to me, and this has come out of, correct, Octopus, exactly. So we come out of this space of it moving too slow, but also we hear project owners say there's no money, and we hear funders say there's no projects. And we hear innovators and entrepreneurs say we can't get to the projects because of the bureaucracy or because we haven't proven ourselves. So we may be crazy, but the idea of Octopus is to basically triangulate that space and create a platform that brings them together, solves for them, and then connects them. Because the pace at which we're moving is not fast enough. That's it in a nutshell. A lot more to talk about there as it starts to go, but born of frustration, but also inspiration to try to solve for that middle ground.
Yeah. So for our listeners, what is a nature-based solution, and can you give some examples?
Sure. And that's actually kind of where we're starting, because it's easy for us coming out of a more infrastructural or city or island government kind of viewpoint to start with things I would call gray infrastructure. We want to start with the green and blue infrastructure. So imagine replicating coral, oysters, seagrass, mangroves, and I can just keep going down the list. But the nature-based solutions that, in the case of, let's take oysters, they filtrate, they feed, and they also prevent storm surge, right? Same thing on the coral side to some extent. So we're talking about living and breathing beings and species that then can be replicated in order to move them faster to places where there are problems. One of our test sites, or one of our test clients, if you will, or user journeys, is includes Jamaica and a coral provision to start to solve some of the problems around how do we replace these and have them grow faster, and be able to do that at a scale that really helps us move in the right direction. So that nature-based solution on land might be similar, but in the case of the ocean and the blue, think of anything that sort of is on the coast, underwater, that starts to do 4 or 5 other things, like I mentioned the oysters do, and we can put a number to that as well. You may have it referred to as ecosystem services. That is also what I would call a monetary or an accounting way of saying, look, natural space, and we've torn up a lot of it on land and in water, right? Natural species in space is something that we did not value in the same way that we're starting to think about it now. We valued it in an extractive way, I guess is the best way to put it. Less so as a preventative measure or as a kind of holistic way of looking at the environment. So a lot of conversations around how do we finance and move nature-based solutions at a quicker pace. Some of it's recovery too. Unfortunately, it's biodiversity loss we're trying to prevent.
That's awesome. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. Bill, do you have any final questions for Stewart?
This is probably a little outside of his area of direct interest, but I was thinking with the woolly mammoth coming back, are we going to have to recover species with the die-off that's begun? Is there an effort to collect the genetic diversity of the oceans, where you could actually do some remedial work and kind of recreate the oceans?
I love to geek out on this stuff. Not so much on the woolly mammoth side or anything prehistoric.
I
but
think we'll survive without that one.
Yeah, it does beg the question because species loss is so great. Yeah. And it's definitely a worry in the ocean now because we don't even know most of that in terms of a mapping standpoint and the species discovery. And we don't even, like, from an extractive standpoint, right? Deep sea mining holds all kinds of dangers for us that we probably should have learned from our strip mining in the Appalachian in the Appalachian Mountains and elsewhere in the world. But I think part of, besides the cheekiness of the woolly mammoths and mastodons coming back and having to deal with that, is that we have keystone species we really need to keep alive, wherever it might be, in the water or on land. And so I think, part of what is going to have to happen is some of those things are going to have to be sort of grown on land and put back in the water. This is what's happening with coral, right? And with coral then comes types of algae. And with algae comes certain types of urchins or whatever it might be, right? Because we can co-grow some of that stuff. So it is not far-fetched to think that some losses will require us to go back and regrow these in labs. I hope it doesn't come to that point for the most important keystone species or sort of the systemic ones. Because when you lose the animals that make up a coral reef and you lose it completely, that's a really tough row to hoe to bring it back in such a way that it was previously, which is why the big bleachings are so frightening, right? So it's funny to think of, having woolly mammoths around. But it does bring up the point that, like, if we lose, the great whites, or we lose this shark species, or we lose, like these large systemic type of species, it's going to cause many other problems. It's a cascading effect problem.
Well, thank you for helping us co-grow the podcast today. Morgan, any final thoughts?
No, this was really interesting to hear about your work, your new role, and we wish you safe travels to Barcelona.
Thanks very much.
It'll be great following up with you to see how that goes. So
yeah, you bet. Thanks. Glad to come on and happy to do it anytime. Thanks to you both.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.